There was a photograph that circulated among Andrés Castellanos' contacts whenever someone wanted to explain who he was. It wasn't a corporate image or a photo from an official event. It was a picture taken on the terrace of a restaurant in the La Macarena neighborhood on a typical April evening. Andrés was laughing with his head thrown back, and Valentina Rios was looking at him with a smile that seemed to say he was the most interesting man in the world. It was a spontaneous photo, unfiltered, unposed, and for that very reason, it convinced everyone that their marriage was real. Andrés was 44 when he died. He was the CEO of Semilla Capital, a technology innovation fund partially backed by Colombia's Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Tourism. The fund financed early-stage startups, that fragile moment when an idea still doesn't know if it will survive contact with reality. Before joining Semilla, Andrés had founded 2 companies of his own. One failed. The other was sold to a Mexican group under terms that no one in Bogotá knew exactly, but which allowed him to live comfortably for years. That combination of failure and success was, for many young entrepreneurs, more valuable than any perfect resume. He knew what it took to build something from scratch. Those who worked with him at Semilla described him as demanding but fair. He did not tolerate mediocrity, nor did he tolerate cynicism. He believed that the Colombian entrepreneurial ecosystem had a problem with self-esteem rather than talent, and that his job was, in part, to convince founders that their projects deserved to exist. In 6 years at the helm of the fund, Semilla had financed 83 companies. Some had closed. Several were still in business. A few had grown significantly in the logistics, digital health, and education sectors. It was a track record that was considered solid in Bogotá, though not spectacular. Valentina Rios was 38 years old. She had studied law at the Universidad de los Andes and worked as a senior legal advisor at a firm specializing in intellectual property. She was the daughter of Gustavo Rios Palomino, a well-known academic in university and public policy circles, which gave the family a surname with weight, though not with scandal. Valentina was reserved in public, precise in her speech, and possessed the kind of presence that didn't require raising her voice to be heard. They had married 6 years earlier, in a ceremony in La Candelaria that their guests remembered for its elegant simplicity and for the speech Andrés improvised at the end, without a script, looking at Valentina as if there were no one else in the room. They lived in a spacious apartment in the Rosales neighborhood, one of the quietest and most affluent areas in northeastern Bogotá. They had a son together, a 4-year-old boy, and Valentina had 2 teenage children from a previous relationship who lived with them permanently. From the outside, the picture was coherent. A blended family that worked, successful adults, an address in Rosales, a well-known innovation fund in the tech sector. Bogotá has few ways to measure success as quickly as address and job title, and Andrés and Valentina scored high on both. No one in their inner circle spoke of tensions, or at least no one did so out loud. Andrés's personal secretary would later say, in statements that would change the course of the investigation, that in recent months he had been arriving at the office with a distraction he hadn't had before, that some calls would leave him silent for minutes, that on 2 occasions he mentioned, without going into detail, that he was thinking about making changes in his personal life. But that would come later. First came the night of the fire, and with it, the first account of what had happened in that room. It was the early morning of March 14th. In the Rosales building, a neighbor on the floor below noticed a strange smell around 3 in the morning. He stepped out into the hallway and saw a thin column of smoke seeping under the door of the Castellanos apartment. He called the fire department. It wasn't Valentina who dialed the emergency number. It was a stranger. When the firefighters arrived, Valentina was standing at the apartment door. Standing there, arms crossed, no phone in her hand, having called no one. The neighbors who peeked out into the hallway said her expression was hard to describe. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking what was going to happen. She watched the movement of the uniforms with a stillness that, amid the smoke and urgency, was more unsettling than any scream. The firefighters forced open the master bedroom door. It was locked from the outside. The door gave way with a sharp blow. Smoke poured into the hallway as if it had been waiting for that moment. The firefighters entered with flashlights and found Andrés Castellanos lying on the bed, in a position that did not suggest someone who had tried to wake up, move, or escape. He was on his back, with his arms at his sides, as if sleep had frozen him in a precise and definitive moment. Burns covered approximately 1/3 of his body, concentrated around his head, right shoulder, and the bed frame. The mattress showed severe damage in that specific area. The rest of the room told a different story. On the desk, less than 2 meters from the bed, papers were stacked, intact. A jacket hung from the back of a chair, without a single mark. The heavy fabric curtains covering the window closest to the point of greatest burning showed no scorching along the edges. To anyone trained in fire investigation, the pattern was immediately irregular. The fire had not behaved as it does when it spreads on its own. It had behaved as it does when someone decides where it should burn. Andrés was taken to the nearest hospital, where he was pronounced dead a few hours later. Valentina was treated at the scene by the emergency team. She had no physical injuries. She answered the officer's initial questions with short, precise sentences. She said Andrés had taken medication for a migraine before going to bed. She said she had slept in the room with the children because he preferred to rest alone when he had a headache. She said she didn't hear anything until the smell of smoke woke her up. When asked why she hadn't called emergency services, she replied that she was in shock. The version that circulated in the early hours was the one publicly confirmed by the family and Semilla Capital spokespeople. Andrés' cell phone, a high-end device charging on the nightstand, had suffered a battery failure and exploded while he slept. It was an explanation with documented precedents in other countries, one that sounded technically plausible, and one that offered something grieving families urgently need: a cause without culprits. The initial autopsy, performed at the forensic medical clinic attached to the Attorney General's office, seemed to close the case. The report concluded that the death had been caused by complications resulting from an explosion with burns and blast trauma consistent with the failure of an electronic device. The document was signed, filed, and Andrés Castellanos was buried 11 days after his death at the Jardín de Paz cemetery north of Bogotá, with a turnout that brought traffic on the main avenue to a standstill for nearly an hour. Bogotá's entrepreneurial community posted tributes on social media. Semilla Capital issued a statement. The Ministry of Commerce expressed its condolences, and Valentina Rios appeared at the funeral with her 4 children, dressed in black, with the same quiet composure that neighbors had observed in the hallway that early morning. 12 days after the burial, a document changed everything. The technical report from the Bogotá Fire Department, which had processed the scene independently of the medical autopsy, reached conclusions that did not align with the official version on any relevant point. Investigators had found traces of a petrochemical accelerant in 3 distinct areas: on Andrés' body, on the metal frame of the bed, and on the outer surface of the cell phone. That last detail was particularly problematic for the spontaneous explosion hypothesis. If the phone had been the source of the fire, there would be no reason for the accelerant to be on its casing. The director of the fire department's forensic unit stated at a press conference that it would be premature and irresponsible to maintain the conclusion of an accident in light of those findings. He used those exact words: premature and irresponsible. 4 days later, the Attorney General's office issued an official ruling. The case of Andrés Castellanos was reclassified. It was no longer an accident. It was a homicide. That same afternoon, Andrés' older brother, Rodrigo Castellanos, spoke before the cameras with a composure that was hard to maintain. He said the family had had doubts from the very beginning, but had trusted the institutions. That trust had lasted 11 days. From that moment on, they were not going to wait for someone else to ask the questions they had already formulated. At Rosales' apartment, Valentina made no public statements. Her lawyer issued a brief statement expressing his client's willingness to cooperate with the investigation and noting that the family also wanted to know the truth. It was a phrase crafted with the kind of care that leaves nothing open, yet closes nothing entirely. Bogotá kept moving, as always. But the name Andrés Castellanos was no longer a tribute. It had become a question. Rodrigo Castellanos was neither a lawyer nor an investigator. He was a civil engineer, ran an infrastructure consulting firm, and until March 14th had led a life completely removed from courtrooms and cameras. But he was Andrés' older brother, and in a family like theirs, that carried a weight that needed no title or position to make itself felt. From the moment the firefighters forced open that door, Rodrigo had been observing, taking notes, keeping track of dates. By the time the prosecutor's office reclassified the case as homicide, he already had a folder with 22 handwritten questions that no institution had yet answered. His younger sister, Claudia Castellanos, was the one who spoke with the greatest precision. She had studied social communication and worked at a human rights organization in Medellin. She knew how to read an official document, how to identify what was missing from a report, and how to draft a public complaint that could not be ignored. It was she who compared the death certificate with the fire department's report line by line. And it was she who identified the most serious contradiction. The medical certificate cited burns from an explosion as the primary cause, but made no reference to the traces of accelerant that the technical report documented in detail. Two documents regarding the same body, produced days apart, that did not read as if they described the same case. Claudia filed a formal request with the competent court to order the exhumation of Andrés' body and the performance of a second autopsy. The argument was clear. The first autopsy had been performed when the case was classified as an accident, which meant that the medical examiner had not been looking for signs of violence. The context determines what is sought, and what is not sought is often not found. Valentina Rios, through her attorney, opposed the exhumation. The legal brief argued that subjecting the body to a second procedure constituted an unnecessary disruption of the family's mourning, and that the existing reports were sufficient for the prosecutor's office to conduct its investigation. It was a legally valid position. It was also the position that raised the most questions among those following the case from the outside. The 42nd Criminal Court of the Bogotá Circuit reviewed the request for 16 days. In the end, it authorized it. Valentina appealed to the Superior Court of the Judicial District. The Superior Court upheld the lower court's decision without modification. The exhumation took place on a Tuesday in September, in the presence of representatives from the prosecutor's office, an independent medical examiner hired by the Castellanos family, and an observer appointed by the court. Rodrigo was present starting at 6 in the morning, though he was not allowed to enter the procedure area. He waited outside for 4 hours without sitting down. It took 3 weeks for the results of the second autopsy to be processed and verified. When they arrived, they confirmed what the firefighters had suggested and what the family had feared from the beginning. Andrés Castellanos had not died from a cell phone explosion. He had died as a result of multiple blunt force impacts to the head. The report described skull injuries consistent with repeated blows from a hard-surfaced object. There was also a penetrating wound in the neck, with characteristics that the coroner described as atypical for blast trauma and requiring further analysis to determine its exact origin. The prosecutor's office incorporated the new findings into the case file and expanded the scope of the investigation. In October, investigators returned to Rosales' apartment, which had continued to be occupied since the night of the fire. It had never been sealed off as a crime scene because the initial case had been closed as an accident. That meant the place had been cleaned, rearranged, and used for months before anyone came looking for it as a source of evidence. What they found on that belated visit further complicated the picture. In the apartment storage room, they found the closed-circuit television system's recorder. It wasn't turned off. It had been disconnected from its wiring and placed behind boxes, removed from its original mount. Any record of what had occurred in the apartment's common areas on the night of March 14th had vanished along with that disconnected device. In the service courtyard, they also found 3 fragments of material that experts would later describe as components consistent with sports archery arrows. Valentina's 2 teenage sons were members of their school's archery team in northern Bogotá. That detail, which first circulated in local media before being confirmed by the prosecutor's office, planted an image in the public mind that the court record had not yet authorized, but that no one could ignore anymore. In March of the following year, the Attorney General's office filed charges of aggravated homicide against 4 people. Valentina Rios, her 2 teenage sons aged 17 and 15, and Milagros Sepulveda, the domestic worker who had been employed in the apartment for the past 2 years and who had been present on the night of the incident. The 4 were accused of acting jointly and in a coordinated manner. Aggravated homicide in Colombia, under the circumstances described in the indictment, carried a prison sentence of 40 to 60 years. The minors would be prosecuted under the juvenile criminal justice system, with different but equally serious consequences. Milagros Sepulveda was not arrested. By the time the charges were formally filed, she had returned to her hometown in the department of Cauca and resumed her life with a naturalness that baffled investigators. No one came to look for her. The Specialized Circuit Criminal Court of Bogotá opened hearings on the first Monday in February, nearly 11 months after the death of Andrés Castellanos. The courtroom was full even before the judge took his seat. Journalists, colleagues from the business world, family members from both sides, and a group of law students who had been following the case since the reclassification. Gustavo Rios Palomino, Valentina's father, took a seat in the public gallery. He arrived alone, carrying a dark leather briefcase, and did not speak to anyone throughout the opening session. Valentina and her 2 sons pleaded not guilty. Their defense team consisted of 3 attorneys with experience in high-profile cases, led by a criminal defense lawyer who had practiced for 20 years in the country's most demanding courts. From day one, they made it clear that they would not merely refute the charges, they would dismantle them. The prosecution built its case on 4 pillars. First, the fire pattern, which firefighters had determined to be deliberate. Second, traces of accelerant found on the body and the bed. Third, the head injuries documented in the second autopsy, inconsistent with an explosion. Fourth, Valentina's behavior in the early hours of the incident. No call to emergency services, no visible reaction, standing in the doorway while her husband burned in the upstairs room. A forensic officer from the prosecutor's office testified that the blood spatter pattern found on the side wall of the room, identified 5 months after the incident, was consistent with blunt force trauma prior to the fire. That the fire had been started on top of pre-existing evidence, not the other way around. That someone had tried to erase what the room still remembered. The defense responded with a precision that unsettled the prosecution in several consecutive sessions. The chemistry department at the National University, hired as an independent expert, had found no traces of accelerant on the room's walls, only on specific surfaces that had been in direct contact with the body or the bed. That contradiction with the fire department's report was no small matter. If the accelerant had been intentionally applied to spread the fire, the walls should have shown traces. They did not. The defense also challenged the chain of custody for all the evidence collected months after the night of the incident. The apartment had been lived in. It had been cleaned multiple times. The fragments found in the service courtyard, supposedly consistent with sports arrows, had been collected without following crime scene protocol because the scene had never been officially preserved. A defense expert argued before the judge that introducing those items as evidence was equivalent to building a case on sand. The most disturbing aspect of the entire trial was not introduced by the prosecution or the defense. It was introduced by the case file itself, in silence. Milagros. Sepulveda, the domestic worker formerly accused of participating in the homicide, never appeared. She lived in Popayan. She had a registered address. She had been located by an investigative journalist in less than 48 hours through basic social media searches. And yet, no official had gone to notify her, arrest her, or bring her to the trial. The judge asked in 2 separate hearings about the status of her arrest. On both occasions, the response was that the process was ongoing. She never made it to the courtroom. She never answered a single question about what she had seen, heard, or done that night. The trial lasted 16 months, 83 witnesses, 147 sessions, and in the end, the judge determined that the prosecution had failed to establish, by the required standard of proof, that the 3 defendants present had acted with a common intent to kill Andrés Castellanos. The evidence was circumstantial, contradictory on critical points, and had been collected under conditions that compromised its reliability. On July 3rd, Valentina Rios and her 2 sons were acquitted without being required to present an active defense. Rodrigo Castellanos listened to the decision from the gallery without moving. Claudia, at his side, closed her eyes for a moment. Outside, in front of the courthouse, she told reporters that the family was going to appeal, that it wasn't a matter of revenge, it was a matter of record. Someone had killed her brother, and until that moment, that act had no name and no consequence. The appeal was filed by the prosecutor's office with the Superior Court of the Judicial District of Bogotá 3 weeks after the acquittal. The document was 112 pages long. It argued that the trial judge had applied an excessively restrictive standard of proof, that he had dismissed valid forensic evidence based on debatable procedural objections, and that Milagros Sepulveda's absence from the proceedings could not be interpreted as a neutral gap, but rather as an institutional failure that should not prejudice the victims. That last argument was the strongest and also the most uncomfortable for the system, because acknowledging it meant admitting that the state had formally charged 4 people, had put 3 of them on trial for 16 months, and had left the 4th living a completely normal life 450 kilometers from the courtroom where her case was being decided. It was a contradiction that the court could not resolve without pointing the finger at itself. During the months that the appeal review lasted, Rodrigo Castellanos maintained a constant but controlled public presence. He did not give long interviews. He did not make emotional statements. He appeared at forums on institutional transparency, in discussions about reforming the forensic system, in spaces where his brother's name could be mentioned without being reduced to a headline. Claudia posted a detailed thread on her personal account about the inconsistencies in the process, which was shared thousands of times and forced several national media outlets to revisit the case with more rigorous coverage than they had provided during the trial. The Superior Court issued its decision 8 months after receiving the appeal. It upheld the acquittal. The justices found that the prosecution's objections, though partially valid in procedural terms, were not sufficient to overturn a decision based on insufficient evidence. They also noted, in a paragraph that Claudia Castellanos highlighted and posted on her account that very afternoon, that it was inexplicable that a person formerly charged with aggravated homicide remained at large more than 2 years after the charges were filed. It was the second time a Colombian court had acquitted the defendants, and in the same document pointed out the irregularity of Milagros Sepulveda's situation. It was also the second time that this observation had no practical consequences. The prosecutor's office took the case to the Supreme Court of Justice, Criminal Cassation Chamber. It was the last available recourse within the ordinary system. The proceedings at that level were quieter than the previous ones. There were no public hearings with packed galleries. There was no daily media coverage. The case file circulated among justices for 14 months, was reviewed by 3 different reporting justices, and generated an internal debate that never reached the public, but which, according to sources close to the proceedings, was far from unanimous. The decision came on a Wednesday in January, in a 4-paragraph statement published on the court's official website. The justices had reviewed the grounds for cassation presented by the prosecutor's office and had determined that there were insufficient grounds to overturn the appellate court's ruling. The acquittal stood. Valentina Rios and her 2 sons were, in the eyes of every level of the Colombian judicial system, innocent. Milagros Sepulveda remained at large. Rodrigo received the news at the office. Claudia was in Medellin when the message reached her. They spoke on the phone for 20 minutes. Neither of them spoke to the press that day. The next day, Rodrigo issued a brief statement from the institutional account the family had created to document the process. It stated that they respected the judicial system's decisions even if they could not agree with them. That his brother had existed, had built tangible things, had believed in the potential of people whom no one else noticed. That no verdict could erase that. That they would continue seeking the truth through whatever channels remained available. It was a statement that asked for nothing and said everything. In Bogotá's entrepreneurial community, the case had left a particular mark. Several founders who had received funding from Semilla Capital during Andrés' time organized an informal event in his memory, with no official name or public announcement, just a message circulated through private chains that brought together nearly 200 people at a cafe in the Chapinero neighborhood. There were no prepared speeches. Each person shared what Andrés had meant to their project. Some cried. Others simply listened. No one in that room knew who had killed Andrés Castellanos, but everyone knew that someone had done it. Bogotá does not remain silent for anyone for long. The city moves at its own pace, driven by an urgency built up over decades that doesn't allow any single name to occupy too much space in public discourse. The Castellanos case was overshadowed by other scandals, other deaths, other unanswered questions. But in the circles that had followed it closely, the closed case didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a sentence cut short. Claudia Castellanos published a 30-page document on an open-access platform 18 months after the Supreme Court's decision. It was neither a legal complaint nor a formal indictment. It was a chronological reconstruction of everything the family had documented since the early hours of the fire. Dates, names of institutions, case numbers, contradictions between reports, questions asked and questions ignored. She titled it simply with her brother's name and the date of his death. In the first 48 hours, it was downloaded more than 20,000 times. The document did not name culprits. It could not do so without exposing itself to legal consequences that Claudia knew better than anyone. But it organized the facts in a way that made it almost impossible not to arrive at certain questions on one's own. A door locked from the outside, a disconnected camera system, traces of accelerant on the body, a penetrating wound to the neck that the first coroner did not investigate because he was looking for the effects of an explosion, not those of an attack. A domestic worker accused of murder who lived for years without anyone coming to look for her. Milagros Sepulveda was still in Cauca when Claudia's document was published. An independent journalist who had covered the case from the beginning contacted her for an interview. She replied to the message. She said she had nothing to say, that she too had lost a great deal, that she hoped the truth would come out someday. After that, she did not respond to any further communications. The charges against her remained technically in effect, but without an actual arrest, that status was a formality with no practical consequences. Rodrigo Castellanos returned to his job in infrastructure consulting. He continued living in Bogotá, in the same neighborhood where he had grown up alongside Andrés. In an interview he gave to a magazine specializing in technological innovation nearly 3 years after his brother's death, he spoke of Semilla Capital, of the projects Andrés had supported, of the kind of leader he had been. Toward the end, the journalist asked him how he coped with not knowing. Rodrigo paused for a moment before answering. He said that not knowing was a condition, not a conclusion. That he had learned to live within that condition without confusing it with resignation. That the difference between accepting and giving up was the only distinction he still cared to maintain. What remained of the case, beyond the archived files and institutional statements, was a series of elements that no court had managed to piece together into a coherent explanation. A fire with a deliberate pattern. A petrochemical accelerant on specific surfaces. Head injuries sustained before the fire. A neck wound of officially undetermined origin. Fragments consistent with arrows in the service courtyard. A disconnected and hidden security camera. A wife who did not call emergency services. A defendant who was never arrested. And a first autopsy performed without looking for what the second one found, because no one had yet thought it necessary to look for it. Each of those elements had a possible explanation on its own. Together, they defied any narrative that attempted to resolve them neatly. Andrés Castellanos was a man who believed his job was to help others build what they didn't know if they could build on their own. He funded ideas when they were just ideas. He listened to founders when no one else was listening to them. He died in his room, in his bed, in his own home, in the city where he had decided to stay when he could have left.
He died without anyone close to him calling for help. The truth about what happened that early morning in Rosales' apartment is not in any court record. The 3 courts that reviewed the case said it in different words, but with the same meaning. There is insufficient evidence to convict anyone. That is not the same as saying that no one did anything.
It is simply what the system was able to prove. And what it could not prove remained there, suspended in the silence of an empty courtroom, in the storage room where someone hid a tape recorder, in the courtyard where fragments appeared that no one could explain, at the door that was locked from the outside, while inside a man lay without having tried to move. No one was convicted for the death of Andrés Castellanos. And that is, perhaps, the most disturbing part of the whole story.